couple of other people who might want to vote. Close that poll and we'll move to the last question. Berry crop most able to use higher rates of nitrogen is, but right, we've got about 11 folks voting. Thank you very much. And now we will move into the presentation portion of the class, of the webcast. And I want to introduce, I don't really think he needs too much of an introduction, Dr. Marvin Pritts, who is the small fruit specialist at Cornell University. He is also the horticulture department chairman and has also, this is his second webcast of this series, but nutrient management in berry crops. And thank you, everybody. And Marvin, you can take it from here.
Okay, and thanks everyone for joining. This is great. What a convenient way to be in touch with everyone. So we want to talk about nutrient management in berry crops, and of course our challenge is the diversity of berry crops that we have out there. And each one requires some specificity in terms of its nutrient needs. But what we're going to do is try to focus on some general principles instead. And probably one principle that cuts across all these berry crops in terms of nutrient management are, first, get a soil test prior to planting. You've all heard this before, but that allows us to adjust the pH and our nutrient levels. And then for perennial fruit crops, once the plants are growing in the ground, a leaf analysis is usually the best way to fine-tune your fertilization program. And if you followed the soil test correctly and got the pH right and got the nutrient levels right, at least for the first 5 or 6 years, you may not have to do anything in terms of fertilizer application except for maybe nitrogen. But hopefully, if you've done it right and put those nutrients into the soil before you plant, you can have that long of a time before you have to go in and start fine-tuning. And for most berry crops, you might be ready to replant by that time anyway. So these are the two overriding principles for all of it. What happens if you don't follow that test and then you find out later, oh, my soil pH is too low and I have to add some lime in order to get those plants growing? Well, you end up with kind of a mess because you're putting lime over top of the planting and it doesn't really work its way into the ground very well and it blows around. And it's always best to do that before you plant so you don't end up trying to apply lime after the plants are in the ground. So soil testing is real good. And then once the plants are growing, we can take leaves from those plants in the middle of summer after things are sort of stabilized and look at the nutrients in those leaves, and we can tell whether they're in the adequate range. And if they're not, we can make a recommendation on how to make that adjustment. And both of these tests, it can be done at Cornell, they can be done through private labs, but the point is using the nutrient analysis after the plants are in the ground is the best way we can tell what to do with your plants and give recommendations. These standard foliar nutrient ranges are good only if the soil pH is in the right range. If the soil pH is off, then these values all become off, and it doesn't do any good to play around with potassium or calcium or boron if the basic problem is the pH is too high or too low. So if you know your pH is in the right range, then rely on the leaf analysis for modifications. And each of those leaf analyses they're specific for different crops. So the blueberry one will be different than the strawberry one, will be different than the raspberry one. So what I want to talk about, though, are some of the specific nutrient requirements for, in this case, blueberries. We'll start off with blueberries because you probably get a lot of questions about that. And indeed, one of the questions I ask earlier was what's the most common problem across the country with blueberries, and the answer that most of you got was the pH being too high. So the first thing and the most important thing in growing blueberries is to test the soil pH and make sure you bring it down to about 4.5. That's pretty low for most crops. And usually it's going to take some sulfur and incorporate it into the soil and letting that sulfur work for several months before the site will be suitable for blueberries. Once in a while you'll find a site, particularly maybe down where sandy is on Long Island, where the soils are already naturally low in pH. You can plant blueberries directly into that, but most soils you have to apply some sulfur to get that to happen. Blueberries are very slow growing. It takes several years before they reach maturity. We figure about 8 years from the time you plant by the time they're really full grown. They have some adaptations to these low pH, low nutrient soils, and if you're walking through the woods and out hiking around, you will find blueberries in sites that tend to have acidic, sandy soils. Usually sometimes it's wet because they can grow there. And one of the adaptations that blueberries have is that the roots have an association with endomycorrhizal fungi. And these fungi actually colonize the fine roots of blueberry, and the hyphae grow out into the soil and aid in phosphorus and nitrogen uptake. That's not all plants have endomycorrhizal fungi. In fact, just a few do, and the Ericaceae family that blueberries belong to is one that has this association. It allows them to tolerate soils that tend not to have a lot of phosphorus and where a lot of the nitrogen is in the ammonium form as opposed to the nitrate form. So in your garden, where you have fairly high pH and the soils are warm, you don't have a lot of water out there, most of the nitrogen gets converted by the soil bacteria into the nitrate form that plants can readily take up. You can fertilize your garden plants with ammonium sources of fertilizer, but the bacteria convert it to nitrate and then the plants take it up. Blueberries have the unique ability to take up the ammonium ion directly, which makes them really suitable for low pH, wetter, cooler soils where the predominant form of nitrogen is the ammonium ion anyway. Blueberries can also tolerate very high levels of manganese because manganese availability goes up a lot when the soil pH drops. So if plants didn't have the ability to tolerate that, when you lowered the pH in some soils, the manganese would go so high that it would be toxic to the plant. But blueberries have the ability to sequester that manganese in vacuoles and allow the plant to tolerate relatively high levels. And the other thing that blueberries can do is they can tolerate low levels of calcium. And in fact, high levels of calcium is pretty detrimental to blueberries. They do not do well where the calcium in the soil is over, say, 2,000 pounds per acre. And a lot of soils have calcium that high. And I've seen soils where the pH is low, but the calcium levels are high, and the blueberries just don't do well, even though the pH is low. That calcium just doesn't help the plants for some reason. This is a blueberry roots grown in nitrate nitrogen and ammonium nitrogen. And you can see that the nitrate form of nitrogen makes the roots sort of die. It causes necrosis. They do not like the nitrate form of nitrogen. Whereas the ammonium form of nitrogen, they can do just fine. Interestingly, if you did this with a tomato or a pepper or any other strawberry, it would just be the opposite. The ammonium force-fed plants would have black roots, and nitrate force-fed plants would be just fine. Blueberries are different. The other thing is that high levels of nitrogen fertilizers are detrimental to the endomycorrhizal fungi and hence hurt the blueberry plants. So you don't want to fertilize with too much nitrogen on blueberries because it hurts the plants and the fungal association. Another thing that hurts the plants is too much chloride. And if you fertilize with potassium chloride or muriate of potash, you may be applying too much chloride. So on blueberry plants, we recommend, if you have to apply potassium, to apply potassium sulfate. That's a lot safer to use than potassium chloride around blueberries. More expensive, but it's safer to use. So how do we manage blueberries? Sort of put this all together. Well, we pick a site with adequate pore space in the soil, select a site with low calcium, ideally less than 1,800 pounds per acre of calcium. High organic matter is really important for blueberries. They don't do well when the organic matter is low. The lower the pH, usually the better, and you can lower that with sulfur until you get down around 4.5. Under low nutrient condition, or under low pH conditions, sometimes magnesium becomes unavailable, so sometimes you have to apply supplemental magnesium in order to compensate for the lower pH, but rarely any others. Usually on your pre-plant soil tests, you might not have to ever apply phosphorus because blueberries are really good at sequestering phosphorus through those endomycorrhizal fungi. The organic matter that you want to have is, the more the better. You can grow blueberries on muck soils, but ideally if you have 4 to 6%, that would be good. It also helps to buffer against that pH requirement. So in say a sandy soil with very little organic matter, you've got to be right about 4.5 pH. On a sandy soil with a lot of organic matter, you can cheat a little bit. You might not have to go much below 5. And so that just provides a buffer for that. And then mulching with sawdust and wood chips to maintain the organic matter and the moisture in the soil. When you fertilize blueberries, we recommend ammonium sulfate or urea as opposed to other sources of fertilizer that might contain nitrates, because again, the nitrates are toxic to the blueberry roots. But ammonium sulfate is perfect. Blueberries really like that. And you apply increasing amounts as the plant ages, up to about 65 pounds per acre. So none the first year, maybe 10 pounds the next year per acre, and then 20, 30, 40, all the way up until you have about 65, 70 pounds on a bush that might be 7 or 8 years old. Work out of Michigan has found that uptake is much more efficient if you split the application between bloom and then 6 weeks later. We used to recommend putting all the nitrogen down in April, but now we've found that it's much more efficient to put it on probably in May when they first bloom and then 6 weeks later. The problem with putting it down in April was that the roots were not active at that time, and a lot of that nitrogen was leaching before the roots had a chance to take it up. So you need to wait until the roots are warm and then put it on in a split application. Also, if you are using lots of mulch, you may have to increase the rate above that 65 pounds per acre to compensate for the mulch, which tends to tie up some of the nitrogen. Here's a blueberry plant. On the left-hand side, you can see a plant with adequate nitrogen and one over here with inadequate. You can just look at the plant, this not nearly as green, and that's the symptoms of too low nitrogen. This is magnesium deficiency, and it's fairly common in New York, and the reason for that is as the pH drops, the availability of magnesium also drops. And sometimes you can get in a situation where, yeah, you got to have the pH low, but it also makes the magnesium unavailable. And you may have to add some Epsom salts, which is magnesium sulfate, to build that back up. And this is a symptom that you might get when magnesium is low. And it's pretty distinctive. They call it sort of a Christmas tree pattern where you get red colors between the veins and the veins themselves stay green. So that's real characteristic of magnesium deficiency. And essentially what's going on within the plant is the plant isn't able to make chlorophyll at that level it needs. So the chlorophyll disappears, there isn't as much of that, and the other pigments in the leaf start to show up. So you almost get the fall colors maybe in the middle of summer showing up because there's not enough chlorophyll to mask the other anthocyanins. Having a high pH is the most common problem across the country with blueberries, and the symptom of high pH is what we call iron chlorosis, and this is similar to what you saw with magnesium deficiency, except in this case it's iron deficiency. The leaves turn yellow instead of red, and again it has to do with the pigments that are manufactured and are expressed when the iron isn't available. Now, interestingly enough, iron is one of the most common elements in the Earth's crust. There's usually lots of iron in the soil. The plant just isn't able to take it up if the pH is too high. So you could add all the iron you want to the soil, but if the pH is too high, the plants are still going to be yellow. So two things you can do. One is you can spray iron chelate on the leaves and sort of foliar feed some iron, and that'll green up the plants, but that's only temporary. The solution to this problem is a reduction in the soil pH. So once you lower the pH, then the iron can become in its active form and be taken into the plant and used to manufacture chlorophyll and other pigments that will turn the leaves green again. Another deficiency that we sometimes see on blueberries, particularly in sandy soils, is potassium. And again, it creates a distinctive symptom of this marginal burning. It looks like maybe the plants didn't get watered and they dried out. And kind of that's what's happening physiologically. Potassium is used to help transport water through the plant. And without potassium, you don't have stomates open and closing properly, and you get this burning. So if the potassium is low, even though you have adequate irrigation, adequate water, you still might get this symptom. And I've seen this, not so much in New York, but I have seen it in New Jersey. But it's just something to watch out for. Boron is a nutrient that's relatively commonly deficient in our soils in the Northeast, and we see symptoms of boron deficiency a lot. And this is a boron deficient blueberry plant. And the grower thought this was winter injury, and indeed it looks very much like winter injury. We couldn't find any pathogen on there. It wasn't a canker, but assumed it was winter injury, even though the winters weren't that cold. And anyway, bottom line is we did foliar analysis. The boron tested out really low, and they applied a couple of pounds of boron per acre, and the problem went away. That's what it looks like on blueberry. We'll see in a few minutes some more distinctive symptoms on strawberry. This is a healthy blueberry field, what you like to see, grass between the rows, straw mulch, and vigorously growing plants. Let's shift to strawberries for a minute. Completely different plant. It's not a woody plant. It's an herbaceous perennial, and it has a target pH of about 6 to 6.5 when we're making adjustments. So for strawberries, growers aren't adding sulfur to the soil. They're generally adding lime to bring the pH up a little bit so it's in the adequate range. Now, strawberries are grown as either annuals or perennials, depending on what part of the country you're from. Some parts of the country, people are doing both. Some people in New York are playing around with annual strawberry production. And in practice, some growers apply up to 400 pounds per acre of actual nitrogen spread out over the season. But data show that strawberry plants can only use about 100 pounds that they can take up. So in many annual systems, 300 pounds is just being wasted. It's just being washed through the soil profile and into the groundwater. Strawberries are very inefficient at sequestering nitrogen. The root systems are somewhat shallow. They're not very extensive. And so you have to really spoon feed strawberries nitrogen, and you can't expect them to take a lot of it out of the soil. We grow strawberries in New York mostly as perennials, and most of the growth of a strawberry in our system occurs in early spring, right after we take the mulch off. And that's when carbon and nitrogen can be limiting, because the plants have been under the mulch all winter long. They've used up all their carbon during the process of respiration. The nitrogen was used up last spring and fall, and now they're deficient in both. You take the mulch off, and they need to put on this really fast growth spurt. These are some data of strawberries in the planting year, planting them in July. You can see how the strawberry plant grows kind of slowly. It slows down in the fall. Then we go through the winter. It loses some biomass during the winter. And the next spring, it just really takes off. Incredible push of growth at that time. So logic would have it that, well, we ought to be fertilizing our strawberries right about here, because that's right before the big growth spurt, and the plants need a lot of nitrogen and carbohydrate then to sustain itself during this rapid growth spurt when it's fruiting. But in actuality, we've done studies that show that those spring nitrogen rates make the fruit really soft and increases our botrytis incidence. We've did this for 3 years in a row, and every year we got the same results. Anything more than about 30 pounds of actual nitrogen per acre really softened the fruit. So if spring's kind of out because it softens the fruit, when should we fertilize strawberries? And the answer seems to be immediately after harvest in July. So you wait until that fruit comes off, then put down some of your fertilizer. But we don't want to put it all down then because strawberries aren't efficient at taking up nitrogen from the soil. So we put maybe 2/3 of it on after harvest, and then another third of it on in early September prior to flower bud formation. That seems to be the best timing. The roots are active, they're taking it up, and you spoon feed them a little bit during that time. We also have done some research to show that fall foliar fertilization helps strawberries as well. It seems to increase the nitrogen reserves just before the plant goes into the winter. If you put fall foliar applications on during the summer, it stimulates vegetative growth and the plants grow more, but it doesn't result in more yields. It seems like if you wait until after growth is over and then you put the fall foliar fertilization on, like October, early October, the strawberry plant takes up that nitrogen, but it's not going to grow anymore because it's too cold and the day length is short, and that nitrogen actually goes into the reserve pools of nitrogen and then is available for the following spring. We found that 5 pounds of foliar urea, well actually nitrogen as foliar urea in the fall, gives us as big of a yield kick as maybe 30 pounds the following spring. So it's a very efficient time to put on a foliar spray. These are some data sort of hot off the press from a study that we did on fertilizing strawberries. On this axis, let's see, get this axis here we have increasing rates of fertilizer. So we grew the plants with increasing rates of fertilizer. And then here we looked at how much nitrogen was in the plant. And I mean, no surprise, we fertilize more and we get more fertilizer in the plant, more nitrogen in the plant. But with just a little bit of fall fertilizer as well, foliar fertilizer, we can increase the amount of nitrogen in the plant quite a bit by just putting on a couple of applications in October. The trade-off you make when you do that is that you actually decrease your carbohydrate. This this is total non-structural carbohydrate. So as you increase your nitrogen, your carbohydrate levels go down, and particularly when we increase nitrogen from fall foliar fertilizer, which is a good way of getting nitrogen to the plant, it decreases your carbohydrates. Now that's not a problem as long as you have adequate carbohydrate, but if you don't have enough carbohydrate, you can actually see your yields decreasing. So in this graph here, we've increased our nitrogen without fall foliar application. As we increased our nitrogen, our yields go up the following year, and that's what we would expect. But if we also increase nitrogen and we fall foliar feed, we can get to the point where we get so much nitrogen in the plant that our yields no longer keep going up, but they actually fall back down. And that's because we're above the optimal amount for the plant and we're starting to deplete our carbohydrates to the point where the plant can't sustain itself during that spring flush. So down here we have just sort of put it all together, looking at the total amount of nitrogen in the plant going into the fall and looking at the yield the following spring, and we can see that there is an optimal point, and you can exceed that with high fertilizer rates in the growing year coupled with fall foliar fertilizer. So you don't want to do too much, but if you moderately fertilize in the growing season and then add a little bit of fall fertilizer, you can be up in this range here, which is good for yield. Here's a graph showing yields with fall fertilizer. This is no fall foliar fertilizer and 5 pounds of fall foliar fertilizer, and you can see our yields jump quite a bit, almost to the same level as where we put 30 pounds on in the springtime. So this is what, I guess 6 times more efficient. And the other thing is with spring nitrogen we're getting softer fruit. So we want to avoid the spring if we can, and if we don't think the plants have adequate nitrogen, a fall foliar application seems to be the best. So the goal of nitrogen fertilization in strawberries is to boost those nitrogen reserves so that it has them available for flower production and early spring growth. So late summer soil applications are good, fall foliar applications are really good. Spring nitrogen boosts vegetative growth a lot. The plants really grow a lot when you fertilize in the spring, but it doesn't have a big impact on yield, and it seems to soften the fruit. And in the summer foliar applications also promotes vegetative growth, doesn't seem to translate into any yield increase the following year. So here's that picture I showed earlier about giving strawberries ammonium forms of nitrogen, and you can see the roots are black. So this is just the opposite with blueberries. Nitrate forms, roots are just fine. Mixture of both, somewhere in between. So if you force feed them ammonium, this is what happens. Now that doesn't mean you can't use ammonium sources of fertilizer. It's just that the ammonium fertilizers in the soil get converted by the bacteria into the nitrate form that the plant can take up. So go ahead and you can use ammonium sources of fertilizer. The only time you really wouldn't want to do that is if you fumigated the soil and you killed the bacteria, so there was nothing to convert the ammonium fertilizer to the nitrate. Then you might cause some toxicity. But in normal soils that haven't been fumigated, you can use ammonium sources because they're generally cheaper than nitrate. Now let's look at some deficiency symptoms in strawberries so you can maybe learn to recognize what these plants might look like when they're short of certain nutrients. Now again, ideally with growers, you would never want to get to the state where you see visible symptoms of deficiency. You would want to do a leaf analysis regularly every 2 or 3 years so you could head off any deficiency. Once you see visible symptoms, then you know you're having an impact on yield. You want to head that off by monitoring plenty of time ahead. So here's a nitrogen deficiency. The leaves sort of turn red. This is a field of strawberries. You can see those red leaves. This would be late July, early August. Way too early for leaves to be turning red on their own. And that is because this field was not fertilized for a couple of years. Sulfur deficiency. It's something that we don't generally see in the Northeast because we get lots of acid rain. And our acid rain contains lots of sulfur. And so the plants just, every time it rains, they get fertilized with sulfur. So we tend not to see deficiency symptoms of sulfur. But if we did, this is what it would look like. Sulfur is a component of a lot of amino acids and proteins, and nitrogen is part of amino acids. So when we don't have sulfur, this nitrogen can't be converted into amino acids, and the leaves are yellow instead of nice and dark green. Okay, potassium deficiency. I mentioned we see this in blueberries. We sometimes see this in strawberries as well, particularly where we have sandier soils. And the first thing you see with potassium deficiency is a little bit of browning around the bottom of this leaflet here. And sometimes you can see some burning on the margins of the leaves. And they also get this funny color, a little bit dark, mottled throughout the leaf from potassium. We'll look at another picture of this up close. So you can see the little bit of burning along the edge of the leaf. You can see a little bit of necrosis here where the leaflets come, and then you can see this little bit darker color on the leaf than what looks normal. So that is potassium deficiency. Often with potassium deficiency, you see this on the older leaves first. The same with nitrogen. You see it on the older leaves first. And the reason for that is that potassium and nitrogen are very mobile in the plant. And they tend to be mobilized from the older leaves into the new growth. So the new growth is a big sink. Everything moves there. The sugar moves there, the photosynthate, the nutrients all move to the new growth. It leaves the older leaves without any nutrient because the nitrogen shot off to the sink and the potassium left and went to the growing point. The older leaves show these symptoms. This is you're actually in the field looking at potassium deficiency, and you can see the marginal burning. Very typical of any plant with potassium deficiency. You see the marginal burning because potassium is so important for water uptake and movement through the plant. Phosphorus deficiency. This is what it would look like. I can't say I've ever really seen phosphorus deficiency in the field. Our soils in New York tend to have lots of phosphorus. At least historically, growers have used manure, and that has lots of phosphorus, and we just tend not to see a lot of it. And again, you can test for it and see if it's getting low. Pre-plant phosphorus applications usually take care of everything you might need for the rest of the life of your planting. So it's not something that we generally ever recommend growers do, is go out and apply phosphorus fertilizer to an established field. And even if we did, phosphorus is not very mobile. So it would take a couple of years before it ever worked its way down into the root zone anyway. So do a good job pre-plant, and then you don't have to worry about phosphorus ever again. The phosphorus, you get that reddish color, is fairly characteristic of phosphorus deficiency. Now, calcium deficiency, that's an interesting one. Calcium is also very important for movement of water in the plant. And calcium is transported through the water. It's dissolved in the water and it's moved through the transpiration stream. It's not really actively moved from cell to cell like a lot of the other nutrients are. It moves up through the water and through the plant. And if you have conditions that do not favor movement of water in the plant, you sometimes will get calcium deficiency symptoms, usually at the extremities, because the water isn't getting out there. So on this plant here, you see this browning at the tip, and the leaf isn't unfolding properly. Brown tip here, brown tip here, brown tip here. This is the extremity of the plant. The water's not moving through the plant, and you get that brown tip. It's analogous to blossom end rot of tomato. Exactly the same thing's happening, except here's in the strawberry. So to prevent calcium deficiency, it's usually not, well, I need to apply lime or more calcium to the soil. That's usually not the solution. The solution is usually make sure the plant is well irrigated. If you have situations where you let it get really dry and then you water a lot and then it get really dry again, you're likely to see these symptoms develop. So here is another extremity. This is a growing tip, and it's already starting to turn brown from the lack of calcium. And again, a runner tip, you see the brown at the end of the runner, and you see the brown leaf here. So you see it in the extremities. So Laura asked a question about how much reduction in yield the field would be seen. I'm not exactly sure what field, so maybe you could indicate what nutrient we were talking about, and I can give you some sense of that.
Marvin, it was the
Yeah.
nitrogen one. I was just wondering
Okay.
if you see something like that, that's that profound, what could you tell the grower, like how much yield might he be losing?
Yeah. If in a field like you saw there without it being fertilized for a couple of years, I wouldn't be surprised if you could lose close to, you could be down about 50% over what you might normally have with adequate fertilization. Nitrogen is a really important nutrient for, lots of things, but plant growth and fruit development. Without that, you don't get the flower bud initiation that you need, and that's determines the number of fruits you're going to have the following year. Okay, magnesium deficiency. We saw this in blueberries. Remember, this is the one with a Christmas tree-like shape in the leaf, and here we also see interveinal coloring. But in this case here, unlike the blueberry, it doesn't turn red. It just sort of turns a dark, funky color. And then if it's real severe, you'll get brown between the veins. So again, that interveinal necrosis or coloring is often typical of magnesium deficiency. Usually you find that when the soil pH is getting too low. And in the case of magnesium, it's not as mobile in the plant. So you tend to see this on the newer leaves first as opposed to the older leaves. So that's one way you can look at a plant and kind of help narrow down what the deficiency might be. Mobile nutrients, you see the deficiency first in older leaves. Immobile nutrients, you see it first in younger leaves. So magnesium is not as mobile. It's part of the chlorophyll molecule, and it doesn't move around as much. It's a big molecule. It kind of stays in place. So you see that in the younger leaves first. Same
Marvin,
way,
I'm
yeah,
sorry to interrupt. I just want to bring to your attention, I think your voice might be dropping a little bit in volume, and maybe just getting a little closer to the mic might help.
okay, I'll try to do better.
Thanks.
So this is iron deficiency. Iron is also a component of chlorophyll synthesis. Chlorophyll is a big molecule, doesn't move, so you see the deficiencies in the younger leaves first. So you notice in this plant here, the older leaves still look reasonably green, but the center leaves, the younger leaves that are coming out, are the ones that are yellow. This is a strawberry root, and it's a healthy root. And you can see lots of nice white roots, lots of root hairs. It's growing really well. Now the next slide I'm going to show you is boron deficiency. Boron is a nutrient that's responsible for auxin synthesis. And if you remember from biology class, auxin was responsible for cell elongation. So when you don't have cell elongation, you have the meristems abort and you end up with stubby roots. So the next slide is a picture of a strawberry grown in a low boron solution, and the root hairs just sort of abort and you're left with these stubby roots. And with stubby roots, you don't get very good uptake of other nutrients. So I've seen time and time again strawberry fields and raspberry fields too where the leaf analysis comes back, lots of things are low, but boron is also low. And oftentimes, not always, but oftentimes, if you correct that boron problem with a couple of pounds of actual boron per acre and get those roots to grow again, the other deficiencies kind of correct themselves because now the plant can take up those nutrients that it couldn't otherwise because it has a decent root system under it. So I look for boron um, frequently when I'm looking at leaf analysis. One of the first things I look at, and indeed, if you look at all the leaves that were ever sent to Cornell in the leaf analysis, boron is the one that's most commonly deficient in our leaf analyses that we analyze here. Some leaf symptoms of boron deficiency: asymmetrical leaves. And then this is one kind of interesting too. This is the fruit obviously. Looks like maybe tarnished plant bug or maybe poor pollination or frost injury, but it's boron deficiency. And again, these little seeds on the strawberry are called achenes. They secrete auxin that causes the receptacle tissue underneath it to expand. So as long as those little achenes are all in gear, all pollinated and all secreting auxin, you get a really nice berry. But if the plant can't make auxin, then these berries can't expand very well, so you get all these deformed berries. Again, characteristic of severe boron deficiency. Now, the challenge with boron is that you can also apply too much. It's one of those that doesn't have a very wide range of where it's either deficient or toxic. So you got to make sure you don't put on too much, or you'll get the burning. The burning in this case, looks very much like potassium deficiency, but it's actually boron toxicity. And this is also zinc. Too much zinc can cause problems as well as too little. And that's why the leaf analysis is so important. Just a couple of things on raspberries and blackberries. We're not going to go through the whole spiel like we did with blueberries and strawberries, but we have the summer bearing types and just some thoughts on nitrogen there. Too much nitrogen can lead to winter injury on summer bearing types because they have to get through the winter, and so can fertilizing too late. Therefore, with summer bearing raspberries, we fertilize in the spring. If you fertilize too late or use too much, you'll get winter injury, and we can see winter injury right here. It's killed the canes. The new primocanes are growing just fine, but the old canes aren't doing so well. Now, with fall bearing raspberry, since we usually mow those down every year, it's too much nitrogen usually isn't an issue. And raspberries have a pretty extensive root system, and they're really good, efficient at taking up nitrogen. So they can handle a lot more nitrogen, and they grow more vigorously with more nitrogen, and they can handle it. So there we fertilize in the spring, and we can fertilize in the summer, and combine the rates are a little bit higher because we don't have to worry about going too late or putting on too much because we're just going to cut the canes anyway. We've done a little bit of work on foliar feeding of raspberries, and we put on these foliar sprays, and then we monitored the uptake of the foliar spray into the plant. We used N15, which is sort of a tracer. It's not radioactive. It's a stable isotope of nitrogen, but you can spray it on and watch it move into the plant. And we looked at various factors to see if any factors might aid in the uptake of the urea that was labeled. And we looked at surfactants. We looked at time of day. We looked at the pH of the solution. We looked at plants that were stressed or not, because a lot of the companies that sell these products say, well, you didn't put it on at the right time or didn't have the right surfactant and stuff like that. This is our control. We were getting as our standard treatment, just mixing it with water and spraying on, was giving us almost 50% of the nitrogen being absorbed. Almost anything else we do either didn't make a difference or it actually reduced the uptake. So I don't think there's anything magic. If you want to use it, about half of it goes on. We did the same thing looking at a potassium analog. In this case, we looked at rubidium, which is in a periodic chart, is the same valence as potassium, behaves the same way. Sprayed the rubidium on, looked at uptake. Again, almost the same thing. Our standard treatment was pretty much as good as we could get. Maybe putting it on early in the morning was a little bit better, but for the most part, it didn't make a difference. The problem with these foliar applications, though, is that even though we get 50% uptake, you can only put on about 5 pounds of actual urea per acre at any one time, or else you get toxicity to the leaf. And if the plant's only taking up 50% of that, that's 2.5 pounds. And truth of the matter is, not all of that you spray on hits the plant. Some of it just goes off into the air and never really touches the plant. So in actuality, you're probably only really getting into the plant 1 or 1.5 pounds of actual nitrogen with every time you spray. So it's not a very efficient way of applying nitrogen. You almost have to spray every day to give the plant the nitrogen it needs from foliar applications. And our data show that it doesn't make any difference anyway when it's sprayed during the growing season. The only time we're seeing a difference is when it's sprayed late in the fall to contribute to those nitrogen reserves. So to wrap everything up, pre-plant amendments are important. Base these on soil test recommendations from a reputable lab. Use leaf analysis to fine-tune your fertilization and establish plantings. And generally, not always, but generally restrict nitrogen applications to the spring. Although evidence exists of building reserve nitrogen in late fall can be helpful if carbohydrate status is adequate. So,
All right. Thank you,
I think
Marvin. Does
that's it
anybody
with
have
my,
any questions? And I
yep.
apologize if there's some problem with the audio for some people. It sounded really good to me, but that doesn't mean that everyone else is having good reception. And I certainly would appreciate feedback about how the quality of the presentation. And so this is your opportunity to ask Marvin some questions about the presentation. Does anybody have any questions? If not, I'm going to move into the final, oh, hold on. Stephanie has a question. Stephanie, I think you have a microphone now if you have one, or you could type the question in the chat box. Okay, I'm not hearing from Stephanie. You might want to type right down at the bottom of the chat box, Stephanie, or if you have a microphone, you are enabled to ask the question right now.
So Molly just asked a question about one of the last comments about foliar feeding for strawberries or raspberries. The data I showed you on uptake was for raspberries. The data I showed you on the actual yield response for fall foliar fertilization was for strawberries. But strawberries and raspberries are fairly closely related, and most of the time when people do these studies, they find that strawberries and raspberries generally spawn the same way. So I wouldn't be surprised if we did those same studies that we did on strawberries with fall foliar applications, we did that to raspberries, whether we would see the same response. Lai Lang Chung here in the department has done those studies on grapes and apples, and he's found the exact same thing, that late fall foliar urea applications increase nitrogen reserves and improve yields the following year, provided that carbohydrate levels are not too low. I don't see why raspberries would be any different.
Marvin, there was a question from Dan Welch about differences in nutrients for day neutral strawberries.
Okay. Yeah, so day neutral strawberries are quite different than the regular perennial strawberries. They have very shallow root systems. Uh, they allocate only about 10% of their growth to roots. And that's pretty low compared to like a raspberry where it's 50% or more. They're these really shallow roots. They don't go out very far. So with day neutral strawberries, you really do have to spoon feed those nitrogen almost all season long. And we recommend about 1 pound of actual nitrogen a day for day neutral strawberries during the growing season. Now you don't have to fertilize them every day unless you're set up to do that. You could put a pound of nitrogen through the irrigation system once a day. but we don't recommend going more than about 7 days before you do apply that nitrogen. So if you're going to do it weekly, 7 pounds every week would be the equivalent of 1 pound a day. But they need that much to get them through. And if you add that up over the entire season, they're using more nitrogen than a regular strawberry. I probably shouldn't say they're using more, but they just need a lot of nitrogen around because their roots aren't really very good at sequestering what's there. So you spoon feed them, and about 1 pound a day. The other nutrients, potassium, phosphorus, and all, that's the same. If you put enough in the ground before you plant, then you don't have to worry about that. And they're grown mostly as annuals anyway, so that's not a big deal with day neutrals, but the nitrogen is. And we don't have to worry for most part about fall foliar applications because most people are not overwintering their day neutrals anyway. But if they would, it would probably have the same response as a June bearing.
Craig, thank you very much for answering that one question. These series have all been recorded, and this one will also be available. It was recorded today, and we will open them up to the general public shortly, so you can, you will be able to get them and recommend them to growers if you would like to do that. I want to thank Dr. Pritts for taking the time today and earlier in the session, and also Greg Loeb and Courtney Weber, because they were the other speakers. It was a little bit different presentation style, and I really appreciate them, uh, you know, taking the time to learn how to do it and everything. I also want to thank all of you for joining us. It really wouldn't be any good if we didn't have anybody listening and asking questions. And I do want to ask if you folks wouldn't mind just taking one quick exit poll, and I'll deliver this now. Um, just give us a little feedback. This is an multiple answer, so you'll just read the questions as they're numbered and then answer them in the boxes. Just click on the box. You don't have to hit a submit or anything, and we will be able to have that data to help us evaluate the sessions and then also maybe move forward with some other webcast training. And then, unless you have any other questions for Marvin after this poll is done, um, that's it. Thank you very much. Pretty much everybody that I expected to weigh in has weighed in, and I appreciate that. And if you have anything else to add, please go ahead. Otherwise, have a great day.